Welcome to Real Foot Forward, a West Tennessee podcast from Discovery Park of America in Union City, Tennessee. Today's episode is brought to you by Jerry Ward Autoplex of Union City.
Thank you, Zach, and welcome everybody to Real Foot Forward, a West Tennessee podcast where we explore the history, the people, and the culture of our home in West Tennessee. I'm your host, Scott Williams. Okay, Zach, as usual, before we start, what is something you discovered this week at Discovery Park of America?
Today, I discovered some fun photos in the Northwest Tennessee Photography Club Showcase we have in Art Hall. Our 2024 spring winners are still on display for the moment if folks haven't seen those. 3 themes are displayed, and I'm really fascinated by the water droplets theme. There's one that shows a water droplet over a dandelion and another that's called a drop of Old Glory, where the photographer took a picture of a water droplet that you can see the reflection of the American flag in. It's really neat.
Very nice. And there is a great big portrait of a little kid, a black and white, that is striking. Every time I'm down there, I see that. A lot of people may be familiar with Art Hall because that is where we have all the pictures of the board of directors of Discovery Park and the former board members, because Robert Kirkland didn't want just a row of boring old photographs of a bunch of old people on the wall like myself. He wanted fun, colorful, exciting imagery, which is really a nice metaphor for Discovery Park of America in general.
Oh, yeah.
So our guest today is Melinda Meador. Did I say your last name right?
No.
I did not. I knew I was going to butcher it.
It's Meador.
Meador. Awesome. Well, you've got, as I said before we got on here, you have your fingers in a lot of pies. You're doing a lot of really interesting things. We want to hear all about that. I know you're doing a lot of history research, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But back us all the way back to the beginning of your life. Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in Paris at the hospital, but I grew up here on my family's farm. The farm has been in my family since 1829, and someone has continuously occupied it in my family's name since that time.
You're one of the probably, I would say that is, I don't know how many people are doing that in Tennessee, but I would say not very many, especially around here. That has to be like one of the very first settlers.
Well, actually, one of my relatives was the original settler of Weakley County, Reuben Edmonston, who came here in 1819 with his brother John Bradshaw. But you're right, West Tennessee is a little different from the rest of the state because we were the last to be settled thanks to the Jackson Purchase, of which we are a part.
And so you, at some point along the way, got interested in history and, did the fact that your family reminded you that you were growing up in the house of an ancestor, did that trigger something inside you to love history?
I don't know if that's what led to my love of history, but I grew up with my grandparents who were older at the time. People in my family tend to have their children very late in life, and so my grandparents were in their 60s and 70s when I was born. And I was fascinated by the stories they had to tell me about life on the farm at the turn of the century. So I've always had a keen interest in at least my family's history. We even have a cemetery that is devoted to our family here on the property. So it is special in that regard. But I became a history major after I went to college and was trying to figure out what to do. I fell in love, not literally, but I was in a history class my first year of college and enjoyed it so much that I wound up majoring in history undergrad as well as English.
And so are you one of those people like me who's done the ancestry.com and done your DNA and all that?
Yeah, I have. And it's been really fun to see just how far back you can go with that.
Did you find any surprises through doing your DNA and all of that work?
It's one of those things that people in Scotland make jokes about everyone being related to Robert the Bruce, but in fact, I am related to Robert the Bruce.
Have you gone to Scotland to go on a Robert the Bruce tour?
Well, I have been there, and I've seen one of the statues built in his honor. There is also an ancestral home there, but unfortunately it's closed to the public.
Yeah, I went this summer to Scotland and checked it all out. It's an amazing place for people who love history.
Yes, it is. It's beautiful.
So you grew up in high school. Were you interested in history, or is it something that came later?
Well, probably later. Gleason, we had one history class that people took when they were seniors in high school, and it was taught by the high school football coach. And so it was not the most inspiring class. It could be very entertaining at times, but it was not particularly inspiring.
So where did you go to college to get your undergrad and then your master's and then your law degree?
Well, I went a long way from home. I went across the state line to Murray State for undergrad.
That's Zach's alma mater.
Racer Nation.
It's a great school. It's really a great school. I went to Murray undergrad, and then I went to UT Law School. And there was I spent a couple of years in the history department at Murray State as a graduate assistant. At the end of 2 years of work, including work on a thesis, we were told that I was going to have to transfer all of my data onto mag cards, punch cards, and feed them into a computer. And I said, I don't know anything about that. I don't want to know anything about punch cards. And so maybe I'll go to law school. And so I left college, graduate school, and went to UT in Knoxville. Didn't have any trouble graduating from law school, thankfully, and started practicing law. Never finished my master's degree until we moved back here. I lived away from this area until 2016. And my husband and I made the decision to move back here from Knoxville, largely because of my mother, who was in her 90s and did not want to have to leave home ever. And we didn't want her to have to leave. So we came back here and built a house of our own very close to her house. After we got here and I had sort of gotten settled in, I thought, I really would like to go back and finish that history degree. And the people at Murray State and history department, all of my professors, of course, were long gone. It had been 40 years, literally. And so I went over and said, what would you all think about readmitting me to the program? I only need like 6 credit hours to finish this thing. And they actually said yes and let me back in. And I wound up finishing my master's degree in 2021.
Congratulations. That's great. And obviously, your life experience in those 40 years counted for a lot of education as well.
Well, yes, they were an education in themselves. That's right.
So how did you end up in Houston?
Oh, well, I got married at the end of law school to a man who had a job with Fulbright and Jaworski, which is at the time was one of the largest firms in the country. And I moved with him to Houston and began practicing law there. Spent a number of years with the DA's office. I clerked for a court of appeals judge, and then I was in private practice for a while. I also worked for an organization called Staff Counsel for Inmates. And that was actually my first serious job. I spent 2 years with Staff Counsel, which is located in Huntsville. And that program caters specifically to inmates in the Department of Corrections around the state who have post-conviction proceedings, writs of habeas corpus. And the state of Texas, unlike most states, decided to create an agency devoted strictly to representing those people, unlike in Tennessee, where people are appointed to represent inmates as the need arises. But that job really gave me a great deal of insight into the criminal justice system and got me interested in racial relations and the history of race in this country. So it really, that job was probably the most important step that I've taken in my career in terms of my long-term interests.
And I'm assuming that your interest in the history of social justice and race relations and all that probably factored in. I'm putting words in your mouth, but from then on, I can't imagine how you could have practiced law without at least factoring in some of that.
Yes, absolutely. It has been a major influence throughout my career. I did spend many years in civil practice, completely unrelated to the kind of criminal work that I started out doing. But that was more out of necessity than anything else. Criminal justice has been one of my major concerns throughout my life.
How do you answer people? And we're going to talk a little bit about your thesis that you worked on, which is how we got connected, and that is really interesting and impactful for this region. I'll go ahead and say it, then I'll ask my question. Your thesis was Strange Fruit: The Forgotten Lynchings of Northwest Tennessee and Southwest Kentucky. What do you say to people who say, why do you bring all that stuff up? That's all old news. It's all in the past. Why don't you just leave it alone?
Well, people do ask me that from time to time. And my feeling about it is that we cannot know ourselves. We cannot move forward as a society unless we understand the things that have happened in the past. And there is so much that is there to be discovered now. Thanks to the internet, we have access to so much more information than we've ever had before. And it is possible now to look at a region as specific as this one and really learn about its history. And that's what I set out to do. And I think it's important. Even the ugliest parts of our history need to be understood. And I don't think it's possible for us to atone for what happened in the past, but we can be better today in our interactions with people if we understood what our past looks like.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm doing a little research right now. When you look at like the impact of slavery, certainly the enslaved people who lived in this area, you still sense the impact today. And so understanding how all that came to be and the aspects of it, I think slavery and the lives of enslaved people were so different depending on the people and the laws and the state and the city. And, it's a very deep, robust area of study. And so I'm sure it took you quite a while to dig through all of it.
Yes. And even when I was in graduate school to begin with, so we're now talking about the mid to late 1970s, my emphasis and my thesis research at the time was related to slavery, because this part of the world, the American South, cannot ever overlook that past. It is essential to everything about this country. And we have to be able to understand it if we are going to survive as a culture.
I think it's also interesting in Tennessee, for example, which is where I've been reading a lot about, there weren't a lot of free blacks, but there were some. And the impact that slavery and the resistance against slavery, by the time you got to 1830, it really made people who were mulatto or mixed race or, any of those words they used back then, their quality of life was greatly diminished as well.
Yes. And there were only a handful of free blacks in the area that I studied. If you go back and you look at the census figures from dating back to the 1850s, you see that there were no more than probably a dozen in these three counties who were considered free blacks.
And so, tell us a little bit about the process that you went through to research. Where did you find your information? Where were you, first, second, third hand, research materials? Where did you go and what did you do?
Well, I'll tell you first how it started, because that really became a big part of my research. In 2009, I was living in Knoxville, and I attended an art exhibit at the Knoxville Museum of Art. One of the most powerful pieces in that exhibit was it was a handmade quilt called Blood of the Slaughtered 1 by a fiber artist named Gwendolyn McGee. And I was so mesmerized by this piece. It was a light background with a tree stitched over the white and the picture of a body hanging from that tree. And in addition to that image, hand stitched line by line were the names of every Black known at the time to have been lynched anywhere in the country. And like any person who's attached to her home, as I have been to mine, I scanned through the list of Tennessee people who had been lynched. And in reviewing that, I came across towns here in West Tennessee, and then my eye fell on one from June 8, 1893, L.C. Dumas, Gleason. Now, I've been here since 1955. My grandfather, who was alive for many years after I was born, had been born in 1886.
Wow.
And I had never heard anything about this lynching. My family's been here throughout that period of time. I'd never heard of a lynching in Gleason. And I was dumbstruck. I had no idea. And I had never even considered the fact that this upper South region would have been the site of lynchings. We think of lynching as being a Deep South phenomenon, what's called the Cotton Belt or the Black Belt across Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas. You don't think about this part of Tennessee being in that group of states that were prone to lynching. And so I came home, and the first thing I did, I went home in Knoxville, and I called my mother and I said, "Do you know anything about a lynching in Gleason?" No, she'd never heard of such a thing. And we had a little town historian at the time. I talked to her. I looked through her scrapbooks. She had newspapers going back to the turn of the century. She'd never heard of it, or at least she said she'd never heard of it. I asked other people here in the community whose families have been here as long as I have. No one had ever heard anything about this lynching. That was in 2009, and Google, of course, was really just beginning to kind of ramp up. And I began periodically to Google this name, L.C. Dumas. And eventually, I began to find articles, and that led me to a website called newspapers.com. if you're familiar with that website, it is absolutely phenomenal. They have newspapers from all over the country. They may not have quite as many as the Library of Congress, but they have an incredible collection of newspapers going back into the 19th century. And I eventually did find a few pieces of information about L.C. Dumas, but in looking at him, I began to read other stories about lynchings in the area. And I also discovered a couple of books, which I want to mention specifically. One is called Lethal Punishment by a woman named Margaret Vandiver. She is out of Memphis, and she taught in the history department at the University of Memphis for a long time, now retired. Her book, Lethal Punishment, focuses on three areas: Shelby County, not surprisingly, where she lives; Florida, which she saw similarities in some of the lynching patterns between Shelby County and Florida. And then she noticed for the first time that there were a large cluster of lynchings in Northwest Tennessee. And so I read that book, and that led me to reading virtually all the literature available at the time on lynchings in America. And there's quite a collection of works now. Probably the most famous is one called Festival of Violence, which was the first systematic study of lynching in the United States. It was published in the 70s, I believe. Maybe the 80s, by two men named Tolney and Beck. They had actually identified every lynching, especially in the lower South, in this, and they're all identified in this book. And there's a very graphic photo that shows pinpointing where all of these lynchings occurred. And the more I looked at that, the more it struck me that there was really no explanation for why our little area would have this large concentration of lynchings. And when I say large, in Fulton County, Lake County, and Obion County alone, that's 3 counties, 50 blacks and 6 whites were lynched between 1868 and 1931. Most of those occurred in from 1870 until about 1900 or 1905 or so. It sort of tapers off at the end, and there are only a few, thankfully, after 1910. But when you consider the fact that the Black population in these counties has never exceeded 20%.
Do you attribute that to the fact that cotton didn't grow as well up here as it did down in the Delta?
That's correct. The one exception, there were some plantations in Lake County way back in the early 1800s, leading up to, well, not the early 1800s, but from about 1830, leading up to 1900, and they were referred to as plantations. But there were only a handful of those. And so we did not have the kind of slave population here that we had in other parts of the South, because no cotton, and we weren't really growing tobacco by then in any large degree either. So relatively small farming communities, probably, I did some research on this, there were no more than a handful of farms that had even 1,000 acres in them, which is something that you would routinely see in the Deep South.
Well, that's something also that I think people assumed that everybody in Tennessee back then had enslaved people working. And, there were much fewer than you might imagine that had a lot of enslaved people. But there were a lot of people that were just a man and his brother and his wife and his 2 sons and, hard scrabble, just trying to farm as much as they could, which I think people don't realize.
Yeah, that's true. We did not ever have slaves on this farm. And it's interesting because actually what my research was on in the 1970s was on the difference between slaveholders and non-slaveholders. And you don't really, until you begin doing the research, you don't appreciate the fact that most people were what were called yeoman farmers. And that is, they owned their own land, as my family did, but they weren't such large farms that a family couldn't do it on their own with the assistance of their neighbors.
Yeah, that's my grandparents. My grandparents even told me they didn't even know there was a depression because all they did was work and grow food and grow the animals, and
Right.
They sustained themselves without any much awareness, and they were in Haywood County, Tennessee.
Sure. Yeah. That's
so
right.
you said you read everything you could get your hands on. Obviously, your local library probably didn't have as much. Did you buy books and order them? And nowadays we get on Amazon or Abe Books. Or did you go to Washington D.C. and do the research there?
I did not go to Washington. I did because of my interest in Fulton County. I did go to the Kentucky State Library, the University of Kentucky Library, and what's called the Filson Society in Louisville. And in Tennessee, I went to the state capitol and went to the state library, which does have a number of holdings. So I was able to do a fair amount of research in those libraries. Also, I spent some time in the Obion County Library, which has a really good regional section as well. So those were my secondary sources. The newspapers provided the accounts of individual lynchings, and I will say newspaper accounts are not entirely reliable, just as they aren't today. But they are our best source of information for events like lynchings that weren't widely written about or discussed by people in books at the time.
As you're doing all this, and when your family members or friends say, "So, what are you working on these days?" And you start talking about this, do you see them getting nervous or perplexed or, wondering, or they change the subject really fast?
Well, I think there's sort of a ghoulish fascination with what I've done. And, but my family has found it a little peculiar that I focus most of my research on death. But it's an important topic. I mean, it's just too important to ignore. And I think because of my background in criminal defense and prosecution, for that matter, I probably have more of a tolerance for reading that kind of thing than the general public might.
Well, I was curious, how do you think all this research and all this how has that affected what you do today, for a living as a lawyer?
I don't know if I can answer that question or not. It has made me be much more concerned about the injustice that I see in the criminal justice system as it deals with minorities, whether they are Black or American Indian or from some other country. And it has also made me much more aware of how that history has affected the Black community. Oddly enough, I went out and interviewed people locally, members of the Black community here locally, about what they knew of some of these incidents. Particularly, I was particularly interested in one that occurred over in Fulton County. And the Black community doesn't want to talk about it either, by and large. There are people who do, and you may have talked with people who are involved in the Reconciliation Project in Martin, which is a really important group for this area. Certainly there are Black members of the Reconciliation Project, but there are a surprising number of people who just would rather not ever talk about it again. And I respect that. I understand why they feel that way. Maybe if they ever change their minds, they'll find their way to reading the same books that I have, or my thesis, or at least looking at newspapers.com.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we get back, I want to talk to you a little bit more about your thesis and what's in it and what you're doing nowadays.
Our friends at Jerry Ward Autoplex of Union City know that purchasing a car or truck is a big commitment. That's why they have the highest standards of service and the biggest selections to choose from. Don't see what you want? They'll even help you find it. Stop by 524 East Reelfoot Avenue in Union City or visit jerrywardautoplex.com.
I hope you're enjoying the Reelfoot Forward podcast from Discovery Park of America. If you are, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and leave a positive review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So, Melinda, I'm curious, for people who are listening who have never gotten a master's degree or have maybe heard the word thesis, but they don't really know what that really even means. Tell us, what is a thesis and how do you go about writing one?
Well, a thesis is just like in English literature, everybody takes that first class in college where they are taught to write essays. And the thesis is the topic for the paper. And that is taken to a more extreme with a thesis paper, which typically, runs in the neighborhood of 100 to 150 pages. It is as complete an exploration as the topic will allow. It involves original research for the most part, not always, but certainly mine involved a lot of original research, as well as a knowledge of the source material in the particular area. And so I came up with the idea of writing. First of all, my first idea was to write about this particular incident I mentioned from Fulton County that involved a family called the Walkers.
Yeah, go ahead and tell us about them.
Well, in 1908, the Night Riders of Reelfoot Lake were active, and we all know the story about Quentin Rankin being hung and shot as part of the campaign to win Reelfoot Lake back for the fishermen and the hunters that surrounded Reelfoot Lake. But one of the things that isn't talked about very much is the assassination, I'll call it an assassination, of a family, or at least a large portion of a family, led by a Black farmer. His name was David Walker, in a little community just on the other side of the state line into Kentucky in Fulton County, a little area that is called Brownsville. Brownsville still exists today. The Night Riders went to the home of David Walker, who was an independent farmer, had about 14 acres of land, had a very successful little farm going. When he died, there was cotton in the field. There was livestock. He had a lot of farm equipment. So he was, by local standards, he was a successful farmer. But they went to his house, and on the pretext of giving him a whipping for having insulted one of his neighbor's wives, when Mr. Walker would not come out of the house as they requested, they went in after him. They set the house on fire. And there's some dispute as to whether he came out first or they went in after him. But either way, eventually, with the house on fire, everyone in the house ran out, and the night riders shot them as they ran out of the house. The husband was shot. David Walker was shot immediately and killed. His wife came out after him. She was carrying a baby in her arms. She was shot. The baby was shot. The baby died immediately. Mrs. Walker, Annie Walker, lived long enough to testify at an inquest 3 days later, and then she died. And a 16-year-old daughter died. 3 of the children escaped, ran off into the woods, and were not found, actually, for some period of time. You can imagine they were hiding. But there was no real justification. I mean, there could never be a justification for it. But they went there on the flimsiest excuse possible. This so-called insult had occurred 4 or 5 months prior to the time they went to his house. The person who had been insulted filed charges against him. It was dealt with in a court of law. The judge fined Mr. Walker and sent him home with having paid the fine, and that should have been the end of it. But for whatever reason, the night riders chose on that night to burn out this family. I was horrified by that. I mean, I still, when I talk about it, I can hardly believe the words that are coming out of my mouth. But as a lawyer, I was flabbergasted that there were no legal consequences for any of this. And if you read the reports of the event since then, they all say nothing was ever done to bring any of these people who were responsible to justice. So I simply couldn't accept that. I could not believe that with an active legal system in this area, that somebody could not have been held accountable for that. So I went out and started digging. I not only did I read every newspaper account that was written about it, I've read books that described it, including one by Vanderwood, who actually wrote the book on the night riders of Reelfoot Lake.
Which is a great book, by the way. Anybody who's interested in the history, we've got several copies here at Discovery Park, but anybody who's interested in this whole area needs to get that book.
Sure, that's exactly right. And I can actually mention something about that too. But the other thing was, it had been suggested by some journalists who came here and who were looking at land having been just literally stolen from Black families. They reported that this land, they thought probably what was behind the murders themselves was that somebody wanted that farm. And I refuse to believe that even in 1908, given the level of prejudice in the area, the legal system would not have taken appropriate action. And what I uncovered by going to the Fulton County Courthouse and digging through the Register of Deeds records was that, in fact, it was handled appropriately. Those 3 children eventually received the proceeds from the sale of all of the farm equipment. It didn't amount to a great deal after they got through paying off certain debts, but they did receive what at the time was about $50, split 3 ways. And the land was sold at auction for non-payment of taxes. And my conclusion, and I suppose people could argue about it, but my conclusion was that the children had decided they did not want to return to the land. They weren't willing to pay the back taxes in order to keep it, because they were certainly consulted about everything else.
And so what about the people that did the crime, that committed the crime? Was there any justice for them?
Eventually, there was one person who was sort of the ringleader of the whole thing, who was charged with the crime. A grand jury indicted him in Fulton County. And unfortunately, by then, other events had overtaken the Walker story. Interestingly enough, the Walkers were killed in early October. At the end of October, early November, Quentin Rankin and Judge Taylor were kidnapped by the Night Riders. Rankin was hanged and died, and Taylor escaped into the swamp. These same people were prosecuted in Obion County for that crime. And in the course of investigating that crime, the connection to the Walkers was suggested, at least in the court records. The fellow who was claimed to be the ringleader for all of this became the state's star witness for the Night Rider prosecutions, but they did indict him in Kentucky. So he's here in Tennessee. He's a witness in Tennessee, but he's been charged with the crime in Kentucky. They wouldn't extradite him until he was through with his business here in Tennessee with this trial. There were several trials. It dragged out for several years, and this guy was a little crazy himself. He wound up getting married during the time that he was testifying in these cases, and tried to kill his wife, tried to kill himself, wound up getting his own prison sentence completely unrelated to the Night Riders in Tennessee. And by the time he got out, I think everybody had just lost interest, and he disappeared. Judge Hayes, who's done a lot of work in this area, tells me that he was eventually found, I think, around St. Louis. But he was never brought back here. He never came back here. And so the case did die. But it was not for lack of some effort on the part of the state of Kentucky to bring him to justice.
Yeah, it must be a good feeling to have sort of put more meat on the bones of that story so people could understand it, and fill in some of the blanks. When you're doing a paper like that, you obviously have a lot of professors who are contributing, looking at what you're doing. What was their response while you were coming up with all this?
Well, I had a really great thesis director at Murray State, and he was very interested in the work that I was doing, but I don't think even he completely understood the drive that I had to find the true story here, because I think it really does go back to my interest in the criminal justice system. I was just determined to shed some light on what had actually happened in that case. Ultimately, I think my committee was happy with the result. They gave me my degree, so I guess that's about it.
Well, and you were definitely the right person at the right time with the right story to be able to do something that nobody else would have done. Your thesis was Strange Fruit, the Forgotten Lynchings of Northwest Tennessee and Southwestern Kentucky, 1869 to 1931. Have you thought about turning that into a book, as people often do?
Yes, and in my retirement, I'm going to work on that whenever I get around to it.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to get that out there for people to be able to read it. A lot of times you can get theses, whatever the plural, you can get theses online. Is this one available somewhere people can check out?
It is.
Do you know where they would go?
Yep. Give me just a second.
Okay, and then we'll also put a link to it in the show notes so if anybody wants to check it out.
It's https:// / Digital Commons, period, Murray State, period, edu, that's murraystate.edu, / ETD / 229.
Great. Zach will put a link to it in the show notes for anybody who's listening. So when you were finished, I know I've seen where you've presented at the Obion County Historical Society and a few others. What has been people's responses to your thesis?
Well, people are genuinely interested in it, and it's been really rewarding to go to these local historical societies and to groups like the Lynching Project of Memphis and the Reconciliation Project here in Weakley County, and see the number of questions that people have. I think people are genuinely surprised to know the extent of lynchings in this area, and truly how horrific some of them could be. In my thesis, I actually go through and discuss, to some extent, all 50 of the lynchings that occurred in those 3 counties. And so, people are going to recognize names when they read it. It makes people uncomfortable, but I think everybody wants to know about it. It's just something that is an important part of our history, and people seem to understand that.
Well, and it's something that happened, and we need to not try to be selective in how we report and cover and talk about history. History is history, and we need to know exactly what happened. So, have you been to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice?
I have not. And I will tell you, as someone who has, it's funny that I can read about all of these cases. I've devoted so much time. I feel as though I know people like the Walkers. I'm waiting until I think I have the emotional strength to visit the museum. I've talked about going down there on several occasions. My husband has agreed to go with me. We have the Reconciliation Project here has made one trip, and they're getting ready to take another one in March. I'm not sure I want to see it as a group, as part of a group. I think it's something that I'm going to have to experience individually. But I do think it's very important that people know about it and go there. And not just about the museum, but also the work of the Equal Justice Initiative that Brian Stevenson has, who's a criminal defense attorney, has developed down there. It's a remarkable effort on his part and the part of the people who work with him to create both the initiative and the museum.
Well, it is an amazing place. I've been there. I look forward to looking and reading your thesis personally, and I'm sure others do as well. We're going to shift gears just a little bit because I'm curious about your house. I love old architecture and old houses, and what's it been like? I don't know how much refurbishing you've done, or if you're just kind of rolling with it the way it was, but what's it like living in a house that historic?
Well, I hate to disappoint you, but I live in a new house.
Okay.
The first house that was built here was a log house, and it was long since gone. In 1898, the second house actually burned to the ground, and my great-grandfather rebuilt the house on this site that lasted until, it stood until about 10 years ago. It had gotten in such bad shape that people decided, my contractor in particular, decided that it really wasn't worth trying to salvage the house. And so we tore it down, but we built the new house on the footprint of the old house. So it sits in exactly the same location as my grandparents' house did.
But the water probably works better, and the electrical and everything.
For sure. The one building that we did preserve was a sweet potato house that my grandfather himself built in the 1930s. And there's a whole other story that I intend to write one of these days about the sweet potato business here in Gleason in particular, and about these sweet potato houses. But they were literally built, brick houses were built to store and cure sweet potatoes over the winter after they were harvested in the fall. And they would then go to market after they had been cured. And so my grandfather had built this himself. It was the only thing he ever actually built. And the joke is there's enough mortar between the bricks that, it could be built out of mortar. But we preserved that building, and I have now turned it into my library.
Oh, nice. That's really nice.
That was a reconstruction effort that a man in Martin did. His name is Stephen Gale. Steve Gale was just a great fellow. He has since passed away, but he did all the reconstruction for that building. And I would love for you to come out and see it sometime. It's quite an achievement.
Do you have a lot of like Tennessee history books? Are you a collector of those like I am?
My collection is a lot broader than Tennessee history, I have to say. I have a large collection of Southern history books. As you can imagine, I did in fact spend a lot of time with Amazon buying books, and a big portion of the library is devoted to those books.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I'm the same way. My wife and I have a very large library. Right, Zach? Zach's been over to our house. Yeah, we love our books. So what are you doing now? I know you can work remote now, thankfully, to the way, after COVID, many of us worked remote. What are you doing now?
I am a member of a law firm in Knoxville called Lowe, Yeager Brown. And I do work remotely with the firm. I probably go to Knoxville about once a month to meet with clients up there, but I do a lot of work here locally, represent both civil and criminal clients from this area.
Yeah, I noticed that you did something with Obion County in your bio. I was looking on your LinkedIn, and you were the felony prosecutor for a while back. Or are you still doing that?
For 5 years. I left shortly after the new district attorney came into office.
And somewhere in here, you lived in Washington, D.C. for a while?
I worked for the FDIC, and I worked out of the headquarters in Washington during the mid-1990s.
I know right where that is. Was it in the Hoover building?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I worked at the museum, which came many, many years afterwards, but it was right next to there. Did you live in the city or did you live outside?
I lived in Arlington.
Yeah, that's where I lived.
Really?
Yeah. You said which one? It was the Newseum, the Museum of the News and the First Amendment.
Oh, News Museum.
Yeah,
okay, got it.
Yeah. So, but yeah, Arlington. We lived in the Donaldson Run area of Arlington. So,
well, I lived literally at one of the Arlington metro stops in a high-rise there. My son went to a little Montessori school only a mile from where we lived. And so I would drive him to school every day, come back, get on the train and take the train into the district to work every day and repeat that in the afternoons. But it was a great place to live for a while.
Yeah, you were smart. I drove every day. My girls went to Yorktown, so they were stayed in Arlington, but I would drive into the city every day. The traffic here in Northwest Tennessee is quite nice in comparison, right?
Yes, indeed. Yes, excellent. Indeed. Even much better than Knoxville.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You've experienced all of it. So what do you think, what is the benefit to living like you right now? You're living in much more of a rural environment than an urban setting. What do you like about it, or do you like it?
Well, there are things that I miss about city life, but there is, a sense of freedom that comes with living here. I don't have curtains on any window in my house, and I don't have to worry about, somebody just driving up unannounced. Well, that does happen, but I experience freedom living here in a way that I don't in the city.
Yeah, when sometimes I'll step out late at night to let my dogs go to the bathroom. It's crazy how quiet it is and how expansive and how peaceful it makes you feel. I was in Memphis yesterday, and for a split second, I was having an anxiety attack. I was looking around at all these cars. I counted for my wife. There was like 35 cars that I could see all at one time, so
it's funny. It's funny because when I lived in Knoxville, one of the first times that I lived in Knoxville, I've been in and out of Knoxville a number of times, but I lived in a house. I moved into the house in March, and I could see all the way around me when I moved in March, and then the leaves began to come in on the trees, and I couldn't see out. I began to feel so claustrophobic, I couldn't breathe in this house. And I kept saying to people, you all can have the mountains. I just want flat country. Just let me back out where I can see the sky and the horizon. And that means more to me than, unless you know it in your bones, you probably can't appreciate that. But I love wide open spaces.
That's funny that my wife is the exact same way. That's what she loves about living here. She's from Boise, Idaho, but she loves being here. And just when you can see so far and the sun sets and the sun rises. Zach is a Kentuckian, right, Zach?
That's right.
Same way up there. So, well, thank you so much for joining us for this podcast and for the work that you're doing. I very much look forward to actually reading it.
Well, please feel free to call me if there's anything that you want to talk about after you read it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thanks to all you listeners who joined us today at Discovery Park of America. Our mission here is to inspire children and adults to see beyond. To plan an experience for you and your family here, visit discoveryparkofamerica.com.